The world woke up to shockwaves from the Middle East. Israel had launched a sudden strike on Qatar. But what happened next was something no one expected. It was just another ordinary morning, until it wasn't. The sun had barely risen when phones across the globe lit up with breaking news alerts. CNN, Al Jazeera, the BBC, every headline carried the same chilling words. Israel strikes Qatar. For millions, it seemed impossible. Qatar, a tiny but immensely wealthy Gulf state, had long been a symbol of diplomacy rather than warfare. Known for hosting peace talks, mediating between rivals, and leveraging its vast gas wealth to gain soft power, Qatar had rarely found itself the target of direct military aggression. Yet now the images told a different story. Columns of black smoke rising near Doha's outskirts. Emergency sirens wailing through the desert skyline. Frantic families clutching their children as they rushed toward underground shelters. The Arab world erupted in disbelief. In Riyadh, Saudi ministers called emergency security meetings. In Cairo, leaders issued statements of solidarity, carefully balancing words while calculating their next moves. Across the Gulf, social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags demanding justice for Qatar trended within minutes. And in Doha itself, the sense of calm, a nation so accustomed to being a mediator, not a victim, cracked in an instant. But the question lingered like a storm cloud over every newsroom. Why? Why would Israel, already locked in bitter struggles with Hamas and Hezbollah, risk opening yet another front? What could Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu possibly hope to gain by striking a nation that, at least on the surface, posed no direct military threat? Theories began to swirl. Some analysts pointed to Qatar's close ties with Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, connections that had long irritated Tel Aviv. Others noted Qatar's massive media influence through Al Jazeera, often accused by Israel of bias. Then there was the broader chessboard, Israel's fragile new understandings with Gulf neighbors like the UAE and Bahrain. Could the strike on Qatar have been a show of power, a signal to both allies and adversaries that Israel would stop at nothing to secure its regional dominance? Whatever the motive, the ripple effects were immediate. In Kuwait, television anchors barely contained their shock as they read the headlines live on air. In Turkey, President Erdogan's government called for an urgent NATO discussion. Even Washington found itself in a difficult spot. The United States maintains one of its largest Middle Eastern air bases in Qatar. Al Udeid Air Base, a critical hub for American operations. Any instability in Doha threatened not only regional balance, but also American military strategy. Imagine the scene inside the Gulf Cooperation Council's private chambers that evening. Ministers in flowing white robes gathered around polished conference tables, voices rising in heated debate. Should they denounce Israel directly? Should they call for restraint? Or should they stay silent, fearing the fragile threads of normalization deals unraveling before their eyes? For ordinary Qataris, though, the debate meant little. Life had shifted overnight. Parents lined up at supermarkets, stocking food and bottled water. Students anxiously checked if their schools would reopen. The hum of commercial jets at Hamad International Airport gave way to tense quiet as rumors of potential airspace closures spread. Qatar, home to the glittering skyscrapers of West Bay and the world's wealthiest citizens per capita, suddenly looked vulnerable. And then there was the symbolism. Qatar had positioned itself for years as a bridge between East and West, between rival Arab powers, between Washington and Tehran. To strike Qatar was not just to bomb a city. It was to send a message. Even diplomacy has limits. And even mediators are not immune. Yet even as analysts scrambled to decode Netanyahu's motives, one fact became undeniable. This strike was not just about Qatar. Its reverberations were global. Because somewhere far from the Gulf in the heart of Africa, one man watched the events unfold with burning eyes. He was no stranger to struggle, no stranger to defiance. And as images of burning Qatari streets reached his office, he made a decision that would shock the world. He would not remain silent. But as the smoke rose over Qatar, one African leader thousands of miles away decided he could not stay silent. When most leaders hesitated, Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary of Burkina Faso, stepped forward with words that shook the halls of power. The world expected silence. Qatar had been struck, its glass towers rattled by explosions, its people gripped with fear. Yet in capitals across the globe, the response was cautious, even timid. Statements of concern, calls for restraint, empty phrases repeated like a broken record, but not from Ouagadougou. Here, in the heart of West Africa, a 36-year-old soldier-turned-president refused to bow to diplomatic convention. Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest head of state in the world, had built his reputation on rejecting submission to France, to Western powers, to any foreign hand that sought to dictate Africa's future. And now as Qatar burned, he saw more than smoke in the Gulf. He saw a test of principle, a stage to remind the world that Africa's silence could not be bought, and its dignity could not be bombed into submission. Traoré's rise was itself the stuff of legend. Just months earlier, Burkina Faso had been drowning under the weight of terrorism and decades of colonial aftershocks. Corruption gnawed at its institutions, foreign soldiers patrolled its soil, and the people's cries went unanswered. Then came Traoré, a captain who tore through the ranks of power with fire in his eyes and the language of revolution on his lips. He promised what few dared to imagine, sovereignty not as a dream, but as a duty. And so, when Israel's missiles fell on Qatar, Traoré did what most leaders feared. He spoke. At a hastily convened press conference, cameras packed shoulder to shoulder, the young leader rose. His voice, steady yet fierce, cut through the haze of cautious statements echoing elsewhere. If they can strike Doha today, he warned, who will they strike tomorrow? If silence greets this aggression, then we accept a world where might is right and where sovereignty belongs only to the powerful. Africa rejects this. I reject this. The words were electric, carried instantly across screens and radios far beyond Burkina Faso. For some, they evoked memories of Thomas Sankara, the slain revolutionary who had once walked these same streets, declaring that Africa would no longer live on its knees. Others compared him to Nelson Mandela, whose defiance against apartheid had turned a prisoner into a president. Like those figures, Traoré's speech was more than rhetoric. It was a challenge, sharp, unyielding, and aimed directly at the heart of power. But what exactly did he say that left Netanyahu, a man hardened by decades of political battles, stunned? Traoré went further than condemnation. He accused Israel of hypocrisy, of claiming victimhood while wielding the sword of aggression. He named the Western governments who looked the other way, their silence bought with trade deals and oil contracts. And then came the line that echoed through history. Africa is no longer a bystander. If they strike Qatar, they strike all who believe in sovereignty. We will not stand idle. Those words, broadcast live, were replayed endlessly, not just in African capitals, but in the cafes of Cairo, the marketplaces of Karachi, and the streets of Istanbul. Netanyahu, accustomed to Arab leaders' caution and Western leaders' calculated ambiguity, had not expected defiance from a young captain in a landlocked African nation. But here it was, raw, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. It was more than just a speech. It was a spark. For ordinary Africans, long weary of leaders who bowed their heads, Traoré's defiance was a breath of oxygen. He reminded them of Sankara's fire, of Patrice Lumumba's courage, of Nkrumah's vision. He was young, yes, but that youth carried no hesitation. Instead, it carried the audacity to call out powers that even older, richer, more secure nations feared to challenge. And so, whispers began. Could this be the beginning of something larger? Was Africa, fractured for so long, finally finding a voice that dared to unite it? Imagine the unease in foreign embassies that night. Diplomats phoned their capitals. Traoré's words are spreading like wildfire. He's calling for sovereignty. He's calling for unity. Western officials had once dismissed him as a populist anomaly. But now, with a single speech, he had positioned himself as the moral compass of a wounded world, because Traoré's defiance was never just about words. It hinted at something deeper. A gathering tide beneath the surface. An alliance was forming, one that could redraw the map of global politics. But Traoré's defiance was more than words. It hinted at a new alliance forming beneath the surface, one that could redraw global politics. For Benjamin Netanyahu, the timing couldn't have been worse. Traoré's words spread like wildfire, echoing from African capitals to Arab streets. For decades, Benjamin Netanyahu had perfected the art of political survival. He was a master tactician, a man who thrived in crisis, who wielded fear and nationalism like weapons, and who built his career on convincing Israelis that he alone could keep them safe. But on this day, as missiles struck Qatar and smoke filled the Gulf air, he believed he had taken another calculated step in a long game of dominance. In Netanyahu's eyes, the strike was meant to be a demonstration, a reminder to the region that Israel, despite its enemies, remained untouchable. He assumed the fallout would be minimal. Arab governments would grumble, Western allies would issue rehearsed statements, and the world would eventually move on. After all, hadn't this been the pattern before? From Gaza to Lebanon, Netanyahu had grown accustomed to condemnation fading into silence. He expected the same with Qatar, but then came Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain from Burkina Faso, a country far removed from the desert sands of the Gulf, shattered Netanyahu's carefully woven narrative with a single defiant speech. And suddenly the story was no longer about Israeli power. It was about African resistance. Netanyahu had not planned for this. He had calculated every move on the chessboard of Middle Eastern politics, but he had overlooked an entire continent. To him, Africa had long been a diplomatic afterthought, a place where Israel once sought allies against Arab states in the 1960s, and later, a region quietly courted for trade deals and symbolic votes at the UN. Rarely had Africa been seen as a force capable of shaping the global narrative. But now, that perception was crumbling. Traoré's words were being quoted in Cairo, in Tunis, in Amman. They were broadcast on Al Jazeera, translated into Turkish, and debated in European parliaments. If they strike Qatar, they strike all who believe in sovereignty, he had declared. The message resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. It spoke to Africans who remembered centuries of exploitation, to Arabs who had grown weary of double standards, and to citizens everywhere who were beginning to question the balance of global power. Did Netanyahu underestimate Africa's growing influence? The evidence suggests he did. For years, Africa had been shifting. Young populations demanding change, leaders speaking with more independence, and regional alliances emerging that no longer revolved around Western capitals. Traoré was not an isolated voice. He was the latest chapter in a much larger story, one that included leaders like Julius Malema in South Africa railing against imperialism, and Pan-African movements calling for unity against foreign domination. And while Netanyahu's missiles reduced parts of Qatar to rubble, Traoré's words built something far more enduring: solidarity. In Nairobi, university students marched in support of Qatar, waving both Qatari and Burkinabe flags. In Dakar, radio hosts praised Traoré for speaking truths their own leaders were too afraid to utter. Even in the diaspora, from Paris to New York, Africans echoed his defiance online, reminding the world that their continent was not a silent observer. For Netanyahu, this was dangerous. His political survival at home depended on projecting strength abroad. Israel's domestic scene was boiling: corruption trials, protests, and deep divisions over judicial reforms. The Qatar strike had been a gamble to shift focus, to unite his supporters under the banner of national security. But now, instead of triumph, he faced a narrative he could not control. The headlines no longer read, "Israel demonstrates power." They read, "Africa defies Israel." History had seen this before. Great powers underestimating voices from the margins, only to be blindsided when those voices grew into movements. Colonial governors once dismissed young leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Patrice Lumumba, believing Africa would never unite against empire. Yet their defiance lit the fuse of independence. Was Traoré now playing that same role, a Sankara reborn for the 21st century, reminding Netanyahu and the world that Africa was no longer silent? Inside Tel Aviv, Netanyahu's advisors reportedly debated how to respond. Should they dismiss Traoré as irrelevant? Should they pressure African leaders to distance themselves? Or should they ignore him, hoping the world's attention would fade as quickly as it had flared? But the truth was undeniable. The wildfire had already spread. Once, Netanyahu's greatest advantage had been timing, striking when others hesitated, moving when others froze. But this time his timing had failed. For as his missiles rained down, a young African leader rose up, and the world began to see the contrast. One wielded weapons, the other wielded words. And words, once released, cannot be bombed into silence. Netanyahu thought the storm would pass, but the world was already watching Africa rise. What started as a strike on Qatar now threatened to ignite a global realignment. It began as a military strike, cold steel meeting desert sky. But within days, it had morphed into something far larger, an earthquake shaking political centers from Dakar to Damascus, from Cairo to Caracas. For the first time in decades, Africa's voice had cut through the global noise, and the echo was impossible to contain. In the Arab world, Traoré's words landed like lightning. Across Cairo's bustling cafes, where conversations often mix soccer with politics, his speech was replayed on phones over steaming cups of tea. Young Egyptians, weary of authoritarian silence, found in his defiance a mirror of their own frustrations. In Tunis, graffiti began appearing on alley walls. Sovereignty is not for sale. A direct reference to his words. Even in the refugee camps of Jordan, where generations had grown up under the shadow of conflict, the young began sharing clips of Traoré on TikTok, calling him the African Sankara who dared to speak when others bowed. Could this signal a revival of something long thought dead, Afro-Arab solidarity? The idea wasn't new. In the 1950s and 60s, as colonial empires crumbled, African and Arab leaders once dreamed of unity. The Bandung Conference in 1955 brought together Asia and Africa in a powerful rejection of Western dominance. Years later, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi would call for an Afro-Arab bloc to challenge global powers. And of course, there was Thomas Sankara, who insisted that Africa's liberation was tied to that of all oppressed peoples, from Palestine to Latin America. But those dreams had often collapsed under the weight of Cold War politics, foreign interference, and regional rivalries. Yet here, in the 21st century, as Israel's missiles struck Qatar and the world's superpowers fumbled their responses, a new spark seemed to flicker. Traoré had not only condemned aggression, he had offered a banner under which others could rally: sovereignty, independence, dignity, and it wasn't just in Africa or the Arab world. The shockwaves were global. In Europe, activists filled the streets of London, Paris, and Berlin, holding placards with slogans borrowed from Traoré's speech. For the West's younger generation, his defiance against unchecked power resonated deeply in an era of climate strikes, anti-colonial reckoning, and a search for leaders who dared to speak truth without compromise. In Latin America, commentators compared Traoré's words to the fiery declarations of Che Guevara, who once told the United Nations that the oppressed must never accept the rules written by their oppressors. And perhaps most surprisingly, even in the United States, cracks began to show. While Washington scrambled to defend its ally Israel, young voices on campuses from New York to California began to question aloud, why was an African leader showing more moral clarity than the supposed defenders of democracy in the West? Op-eds in progressive newspapers asked whether a new axis of resistance was forming, one that crossed continents, languages, and faiths. But the most decisive reaction came from Qatar itself. Doha's leadership, bruised yet unbroken, seized the moment. Within days, Qatari diplomats were on planes to African capitals, offering aid, trade, and partnerships. What might have been a humiliating blow was transformed into an opportunity to weave closer ties with Africa. Ties no longer based only on economics, but on solidarity. And social media amplified it all. Hashtags like #AfricaSpeaks and sovereignty for all trended simultaneously in Nairobi, Casablanca, and Jakarta. For the first time in years, there was a sense of a shared global conversation, one not controlled by Washington, Brussels, or Beijing, but by voices rising from the global south. Of course, skeptics scoffed. They asked, could this truly last? Was this a momentary burst of anger or the birth of something deeper? After all, alliances are fragile and unity across continents even more so. But history suggested otherwise. Every great shift, from the independence movements of the mid-20th century to the rise of the non-aligned movement, had begun with sparks like this. Unexpected moments when ordinary people saw their struggles reflected in one another. Could Africa and the Arab world, divided for so long by geopolitics, truly find common ground again? Could Traoré's voice be the thread that stitched together a new fabric of resistance? One woven not in the halls of Washington or Moscow, but in the streets of Ouagadougou and Doha? These were no longer rhetorical questions whispered in classrooms or activist meetings. They were questions now asked by journalists, diplomats, and intelligence agencies in the world's most powerful capitals. The possibility of a new Afro-Arab solidarity had moved from fantasy to geopolitical speculation. And in that speculation, something even more daring emerged. And suddenly, whispers of a new, non-aligned movement began to surface. One speech, one moment, but possibly the beginning of a new era in global politics. It is rare in history that a single voice cuts through the noise of nations and forces the world to listen. Yet, as the dust of the Qatar strike settled and the headlines shifted, Ibrahim Traoré's defiance lingered like thunder after lightning. It wasn't just what he said. It was what it symbolized. For decades, Africa had been cast as the silent spectator of global affairs, a continent spoken about, not spoken to. But Traoré's words rewrote that script. He had refused silence. He had claimed sovereignty not just for Burkina Faso, but for a continent weary of exploitation and double standards. And in doing so, he lit a signal fire for others. Analysts and think tanks from Washington to Brussels scrambled to interpret the shockwave. Some dismissed it as symbolic rhetoric from a populist soldier. Others warned that this was no passing storm but the first crack in an old world order. If Africa no longer accepts silence, one European diplomat remarked privately, then the balance of power will never be the same again. The implications stretched far beyond Israel. For Netanyahu, Traoré's stand marked a dangerous precedent. Defiance not from familiar adversaries in Tehran or Beirut, but from unexpected quarters thousands of miles away. It exposed the fragility of Israel's narrative and hinted at resistance spreading in forms he could not predict nor easily suppress. For Qatar, the moment was transformative. Once positioned as a small Gulf state punching above its weight, it now found itself with unexpected allies in Africa. Doha began to realize that its survival in a volatile region might not rest solely on American bases or Western diplomacy, but on solidarity with nations who shared its vulnerability and its determination to be heard. But the biggest shift, the one historians may one day mark as the true beginning of a new era, was what this meant for Africa itself. Imagine a generation of young Africans watching Traoré's speech on their phones. In Lagos, students whispering that sovereignty was no longer a dream, but a right. In Nairobi, activists drawing parallels between Africa's exploitation by global corporations and Qatar's vulnerability to military aggression. In Johannesburg, memories of Mandela's defiance against apartheid rekindled, now echoing through a new voice. Could this be the seed of a multipolar world, where Africa was no longer the chessboard but a player in the game? The possibilities are both exhilarating and dangerous. On one hand, a new Afro-Arab solidarity could emerge, not unlike the unity dreamed of in the 1960s, where leaders like Nkrumah, Nasser, and Sankara spoke of resisting imperialism together. Social media now provides the connective tissue those leaders lacked, a tool to amplify voices instantly across borders and oceans. Movements that once died in silence now flourish in hashtags and viral speeches. On the other hand, such defiance invites confrontation. History reminds us that powers rarely surrender dominance willingly. Traoré's boldness may embolden others, but it also paints a target on his back. Sankara's assassination in 1987 stands as a grim reminder of what happens when young African leaders threaten entrenched interests. Could Traoré escape that fate, or was his speech the first step toward a dangerous path? The suspense hangs heavy. Will this moment ignite a larger confrontation between Africa and the traditional powers who have long sought to control it? Or will it mark the birth of a multipolar order, one where Africa, the Arab world, and other nations of the global south claim their seat at the table of power? Analysts sketch scenarios. Some envision a new non-aligned movement, a coalition stretching from West Africa to the Middle East to Asia, standing outside the orbit of Washington, Moscow, or Beijing. Others predict a more subtle shift. African nations negotiating with stronger voices, demanding fairer trade, rejecting military interference, and shaping global debates on climate, resources, and security. And then there is the most powerful scenario of all, that Traoré's speech will inspire future generations. Leaders not yet born may one day cite this moment as their spark, just as today's revolutionaries cite Sankara, Mandela, or Lumumba. A reminder that one speech, spoken at the right time, can echo across centuries. The cameras may have turned away, and the world's headlines may have shifted to the next crisis. But the ripple remains, spreading outward, impossible to contain. Because history has a way of preserving such moments, chiseling them into the collective memory of nations. And in this memory, one detail stands out. The world listened. History will remember this as the day a young African leader spoke against the powerful, and the world listened.